All right, welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Got a few things to get to before we get started. First thing I'm going to do is go to Jeff Cohen. Jeff, tell me what's going on in the pod, man. How you doing tonight?
Thank you very much, Bruce. Yes, baseball and BBQ on all your podcast apps. This week we have Art Shamsky of 1969 New York Mets. Wrote a book, Met Stories I Only Tell My Friends. But you know what? It's more than Mets. It's not just Met Stories. It's great book. We also have, a couple of years ago, I met a guy out in Tempe, Arizona, who works at the LA Angels spring training camp. So he's on telling us a little inside dope of the Los Angeles Angels coming into the beginning of the season. And a little sneak peek next Saturday, dropping on the podcast is none other than Buck Showalter. So thank you, Bruce.
So, I said it before we started recording. Jeff and Len are getting big time. And I don't know how much longer we're going to have Jeff here on Monday night. He may be too big for us at some point, but Dixie, we spoke earlier today. You have a trivia question for the crowd, so I'm just going to step aside, go get them.
Okay, for everyone who's here and interested in just a little bit of trivia, this is just one question, has one answer. In a World Series many years ago, a player batted 4 times in 4 different games. He batted once a game 4 times as a pinch hitter. His line for that World Series was 1 walk, 1 strikeout, and 2 home runs. Split into 4 games. The question is, who was the guy?
James Lamar Dusty Rhodes.
Wrong.
All right, we're going to let that one sit out there for a bit, and we're going to go back to Dixie later in the meeting for the answer. So we'll get started with that in a little while. All right. For those of you in the New York, New Jersey area, Molly and I are going to be traveling to Little Falls, New Jersey this weekend for the Elysian Fields Chapter's Celebrate Baseball event this Sunday from 12 to 5 at the Yogi Berra Museum. 3 presentations will be on the program with Vice Chair Paul Semendinger, SABR Director Tara Krieger, and friend of our chapter, Dan Sichalski, appearing. Museum admission is required. If you're in the area, please stop by to have a great afternoon with dozens of fellow baseball fans and SABR members like Jeff Cohen, who says he's going to be there. Can't wait to see you, Jeff. Friday, May 30th. We've talked about this before. I keep wanting to plug this. We are going to the Nashua Silver Knights game. It's our first chapter social event, community outreach event of 2025, and everyone in the area is invited. We're going to meet in the parking lot of historic Holman Stadium at 4:30 p.m. to set up our table and display for the 6:03 start. We're going to be answering fans' questions before, during, and after the game. And it's a fireworks night, too. So come on out to historic Holman Stadium on May 30th for a really great time, but not to be outdone. Last week, I had announced that the New Hampshire Fisher Cats had come up with a date for us on Friday, July 25th. Well, there's been a change. We are now going to be there Friday, July 19th, 1 week earlier, when we're heading down to Delta Dental Stadium, because they have given us a table for one of their nights where they are playing as their alter ego. Hang on to your hats. The New Hampshire Space Potatoes. They'll be taking on the Hartford Yardcoats at 6:35 p.m. on Friday, July 18th. And once again, we're going to be there doing the same thing. We'll meet at the ballpark at 5 o'clock. There's fireworks that night. We want a really big crowd to come out and show the fans what SABR is all about. And we're going to have a good time, too. If you have any questions, you want to sign up for this event, please email me directly at bruce@brucemcclurenh.com. Now, do you have any friends or family members who love SABR? Now is the time to encourage them to join as we kick off the SABR 500 Club membership drive. The SABR 500 Club is a referral-based membership drive with the goal of welcoming 500 new members now through April 30th. New members who do sign up for an annual or multi-year membership during the referral period will receive a custom baseball card set featuring SABR Rucker archive images, easy for me to say, of members of the 500 Home Run Club. Current members who refer 3 or more new members during the drive, regardless of membership type, will receive their choice of a card set or a SABR logo lapel pin. For more information, go to sabr.org/500club or email me directly for details. All right, so I think I got all the stuff out of the way. Let's get on to our feature presentation. The generally accepted belief about baseball's North American development is that it is an American game, a product of purely American ingenuity and invention exported to Canada as a finished product. In his book, Old Ontario at Bat, historian William Humber begs to differ. He argues instead that in Canada, the steps in the game's evolutionary process were of a Canadian agency, largely independent of an American influence. His book advances this viewpoint as baseball's unheralded ancestry, busting myths and clarifying understanding along the way. The book is the result of decades of research into the game's origins and development in Canada. SABR member William Humber is widely acknowledged as Canada's premier baseball historian. On top of countless presentations about Canadian baseball history that he has done across North America, Humber has also authored several groundbreaking books on the topic. The Bowmanville, Ontario resident was instrumental in the forming of the Toronto Hanlan's Point chapter, and he played a central role in the organization of Toronto's first SABR convention back in 1981. He is also the only Canadian to have served on our board of directors, having done so in 1982 and 83, I believe. William Humber, welcome to Northern New England, good sir. How are you this evening?
Wonderful to be with you guys. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm stepping aside. It's all yours. Go get them.
Okay. So, well, first of all, welcome, and it's great to be with you folks and to be on this call. I'm just going to try and get that. There we are. There we're up and ready, and we're ready to go. So, as Bruce said, my name is Bill Humber. I write as William Humber. It only ever got me in trouble once when apparently there was an English civil engineer named William Humber who wrote books about civil engineering in the 19th century. And on Google at one point, my face would show up next to the, when you Googled me, and pictures of the books I had written. And it told everyone that I had been born in 1820 and died in 1880. And my students at the time looked at that and realized that either I was a zombie or a vampire. So I kind of like the vampire better, but you know, what the heck. So Old Ontario at Bat, I owe so much to the Center for Canadian Baseball Research and Andrew North, who, amongst the many other things that he's done in baseball, started the center about 10 years ago with an annual conference, and which continues to flourish. We had Larry Gerlich there this year to talk about his new book on Bob Emsley, which won, of course, a SABR book in 2024. Sean Kane, a wonderful baseball artist. You can look up his work. He does a lot of work with artist inspired baseball gloves. You really have to look at it to kind of sense what I mean. And finally, the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, Ontario, under the stewardship and leadership of Scott Crawford. They are, in fact, the sole right now distributors of Old Ontario at Bat. We're doing a lot with them to try and increase the awareness of the topic in Canada. So I begin with an observation that this writer made in a letter to the Toronto Star 50 years ago when he referred to baseball as American culture at its best. And it's not a mistaken comment. It's just a limited comment. The author of that was a guy named Bill Humber from Bowmanville, Ontario. Yeah, that's me. So I've grown in 50 years at least to have a somewhat larger appreciation of the game as it's played in North America and around the world. And perhaps this New Yorker cartoon captures best, as I can find, for sometimes the mystique associated with the Canadian story as it's known in the United States. I trust everyone could read that. But if not, I'll read it. You seem familiar, yet somehow strange. Are you by any chance Canadian? So this comment here is is perhaps the one that will rile some people. It basically is a statement that the development of baseball, modern baseball as we know it today, was a regional phenomenon. It owes so much to the not only experimentation, but the beginning of the application of aspects of modernity, for want of a better term, to the game of baseball. What had been a folk game, largely, if not solely developed in the English countryside and elsewhere, when it came to North America, it retained that English identity as a folk game until well into the 19th century. And well into the 19th century, it would flourish in everywhere from Cincinnati to New York, Philadelphia, to Massachusetts and Boston, and in Canada and Ontario, as we know Ontario today. We know that the first reference to the word baseball is from the Little Pretty Book. We don't actually have a copy of the first ever book that came out in 1744, but we can be fairly confident that baseball was under the letter B and was the aspect that was included in the book, which really what that means in essence is that the name had been around for a while. It just suddenly got common currency at that time. We know that the first appearance of the word baseball in an account contemporaneous, I can't even say it, with its time was in 1749. The Prince of Wales, the then Prince of Wales, was playing it. It was reported in the newspapers of its day. And a year before, he had actually been playing something that Mary Lapel, or Lady Hervey, as she was known, would refer in her diary to the game of baseball with his children. One of those children would eventually come to the throne as George III. And the Prince of Wales, who was commented on playing this game in the newspaper, sadly, he did not make it to the throne. He died in 1751. You can see by this picture, he was one of the original California Angels. So baseball, as we know it, has many, many, many instances of being mentioned as part of life in North America. This is an account from New Brunswick. What is now the province of New Brunswick was in 1793, the colony of New Brunswick, on the 4th day of May, 1793, and that other suggests they were playing a game of baseball. The problematic feature of this account, of course, it's many, many years, almost 70 to 80 years after the fact, and so we always have to wrestle with those realities. A second account from actually even earlier than that was this one that was printed in the Montreal newspaper in 1860 and argued that a team of warriors of Joseph Brant in 1792 put on a game of baseball for the then visiting Duke of Kent, who was in the Niagara region on tour, as it were, of the new of what Ontario in those days was called Upper Canada. This one is a little less, we're a little less certain of this one, although there are some possibly reasons for saying it's not totally implausible. And one of the reasons for that is the Duke of Kent was the child of George III, somebody we have an account of playing baseball, and the grandson of the Prince of Wales, the ill-fated Prince of Wales, who died in 1751, but we have a news account of them playing baseball in 1749. So not totally implausible, although highly unlikely, quite possibly another game, lacrosse or who knows what, but doesn't say that, it says baseball. Earliest accounts of baseball in written form are in the diary of Eli Plater in what was then York, is now the city of Toronto. You can see down about 6 lines, they were playing ball. Again, it's always, you never know for certain whether that was baseball as we would think of it today. But the Belden Atlas, which is on your right, produced in 1878, did talk about a game of ball that was being played that very same year, 1803, near Port Hope in Ontario, which is about 60 miles east of Toronto. And it just turns out that the two proponents of those games, the Eli Plater game and the fellow who was leading the game of baseball in Port Hope in 1803, were brothers-in-law. So not implausible that two family members would have a conversation about the game. Or other early accounts, Militia Muster Day on the 4th of June, which significantly was the birthday of George III. He's the guy whose statue was pulled down in New York City because, of course, he's the guy that took most of the blame for the American Revolution, when in fact it was probably British parliamentarians who deserved more of the credit for messing up that entire situation. And this account appears, as I say, in a report in 1874 in a Hamilton paper about the playing of the old-fashioned game of baseball in 1819 in Hamilton. The diagram on your left in this one is the diagram that Adam Ford drew that appeared in the Sporting Life paper of the 5th of May, 1886, and referred to a ball game being played in Beachville, Ontario, between Woodstock and Ingersoll, two communities west of Toronto. And the drawing is remarkably similar to a drawing that was in Moreland's book, Baldom, released in 1914, but there are enough differences between them to suggest that, in fact, neither influenced the other. This is one of the more notorious characters in Ontario Upper Canadian history. His name is William Lyon Mackenzie. He was the first mayor of Toronto. In 1834, in 1837, he led one of the most bungled attempts to overthrow the government of Upper Canada. He fled to the United States. And he produced a newspaper magazine called Mackenzie's Gazette out of Rochester and wrote about a murder in a baseball game in Lower Canada, which of course today is Quebec, in 1838. So it's occurring at the same time as the Beachville game. 1845, we have the banning of baseball, or ball, as it's said in this report, on the Lord's Day, this Sabbatarian rule. I should say that banning of ball in Ontario lasted until 1950. It was only that year that the Toronto Maple Leafs of the International League were finally able to play baseball on Sunday. Normally, what they would have done before that time was to play a game Saturday night, go to Buffalo or Rochester the next day and play, and then come back to Toronto on Monday to play another game in the series. And finally, we have this account from Goderich, Ontario in 1848, referring to the game of baseball, B-A-S-S, ball, and that was, of course, the old-time spelling of baseball. Now, one can say, well, were these games baseball as we know it today? No. I mean, there's some argument that the games played in the 18th century in England were, in fact, played without a bat, that the distinguishing feature was a ball and a series of stations that players could run to, but that they weren't baseball as we know it today. But then one could also argue that the New York rules that came in the 1840s in New York were also not baseball as we know it today. While they did eliminate the practice of plugging, i.e. throwing the ball at a runner between bases, and if connecting, he was out, and did remove one of the more peculiar aspects, I think, of the old-fashioned game is that in many respects it resembled cricket in being a 360-degree game. And of course, the significant development of baseball was to come up with the 90-degree game, the 90-degree angle allowing spectators to be much closer to the action than they can be in a cricket match. I've been to international test matches in London at Lord's Cricket Ground, and I was struck by the fact that even though I had some of the best seats, I was a long way from the action. The wicket, of course, is in the center of a 360-degree oval, effectively. The first organized teams in Ontario that we have records of are the Hamilton Young Canadians. They are formed in 1854, may have been around before that. The Burlingtons also of Hamilton in 1855, and all of this appears in Hamilton directories within a few years after the fact of their formation. One would always like to find more accounts germane to the particular period of time, but this is what one must put up with at this time in terms of discovery. And this shows Hamilton, Ontario at the time and where baseball games were played in that city at that time. Hamilton, for those unfamiliar with it, is about halfway between Niagara and Toronto on Lake Ontario. There was a ball club formed in 1856 in London, Ontario. London's about 120 miles west of Toronto, but essentially halfway between Toronto and Detroit. And there was a well-organized team with, as one can see, a lot of features associated with that team as early as 1856. The intriguing thing about the London Cricket Club, there's a guy under the committee named James Gillian. His son, Tom Gillian, was one of the first umpires recognized by the National League in the late 1870s. This is a box score that appears in the New York Clipper, and thank goodness for the New York Clipper. I probably would not have been able to compile as much about early baseball in Canada, particularly in Ontario, were it not for the fact that undoubtedly ball players in Ontario became so frustrated with sending a report of their game to the local paper and maybe getting a paragraph too, that they would send it off to the New York Clipper and they would actually print the entire box score. This case, you can see that the game played in London in 1856 was a 2-inning game with 9 aside. This is the first box score that appears in a Canadian newspaper. It's in 1858, and it may be the worst box score you'll ever see. But what it does tell us is that these were 5-inning games that they were playing. 5-inning games, and we also know that they had 11 aside. We know that because a year later, or 2 years later, Woodstock plays Ingersoll, 2 matches, both of which are covered in the New York Clipper, and both of which show that there, in fact, were 11 aside, and all players had to be retired before the other team could come to bat, and that these were 5-inning games that they were playing. This is the first account we have of the New York game. The rules we're generally familiar with today. It appears in Hamilton in 1859. It featured a team from Toronto and a team from Hamilton. The Young America team that really confuses people was actually the team based in in Hamilton. The Young Canadian team, despite the fact that there was a team called the Young Canadian Hamilton, was the name of the team from Toronto. It really mucks with you when you're doing your history and you have to start sorting these out. But these were the first 2 games, or the first game, we should say, played under those rules. But as I point out, the game had a well-organized structure long before this particular game was played. This is the suspension bridge in Niagara Falls that connects the American and the Canadian side, built in the early 1850s. An extraordinary work of engineering, about the only thing I have in common with William Humber, the 19th century British engineer. The fact that this bridge is an extraordinary 2-layered bridge. Passengers could walk on the bottom, horse and drawn carriages. Harriet Tubman used this bridge to bring escaped slaves from the United States into freedom into Canada on the right-hand side of the picture. As you can see in the distance, there's Niagara Falls. And it was here that that first baseball game of an international character was played between the Burlingtons of Hamilton and the Queen City of Buffalo. Now, the big attraction was probably, in fact, a guy named Signor Farini, who was a tightrope walker who purported to be an Italian nobleman, but in fact was actually from the town that I live in, Bowmanville, and he learned to practice tightrope walking when the circus would come to town. And he was the guy that drew the crowd from not only Buffalo, but also from Hamilton, when you could pay 50 cents for a return trip on the Great Western Railway. Finally, as I mentioned, this was the terminus of the Underground Railroad on the Canadian side. And significantly, 9 years later, when a tournament for black baseball teams was being mooted in London, Ontario, they received inquiries from a baseball team that was living near the suspension bridge in Niagara in the Canadian side. And I suspect that possibly the first spectators at that first baseball game international game played in 1860 may have been a number of expat Black Americans who'd come out to watch baseball and subsequently formed a baseball team. I only mention this one because Bob Addy is the first Canadian to play what we now recognize as Major League Baseball. He played for Rockford City in the 1871 season. He would later play for the Chicago White Stockings in the first season of the National League in 1876. He may be the guy on the left hand of this picture. There remains some doubt as to that. The name is not spelled Addy, A-D-D-Y, but in looking at the directories of the city of Port Hope from that period, there's no name even close to this. and the description of him and the fact that he was a prominent cricketer as well in Canada or Ontario at that time says to me, this is the first box score we have of Bob Addy playing baseball. And I've subsequently found news references to the fact that indeed he did play baseball in Canada before he went to the United States. This is a picture of the first baseball team we have of a photo of the Woodstock Young Canadians. It is a frustration. One wishes there were more photographs, but one has to take what they can. As you can see, they've got, well, I'll just let you look at the picture and draw your own conclusions as to their character. This is one of the more prominent teams that developed in Ontario, the Maple Leaf Baseball Club of Guelph in 1870. They would subsequently become the team that George Sleeman, that the guy in the middle of the picture wearing the suit, would take to the Watertown semi-professional baseball tournament, as it was called, in 1874 and win the first prize. Among the teams they defeated was the Ku Klux Klan Club of Oneida, New York. And the Watertown paper kind of, it was kind of a neat way it wrote it. It referred to the Dominions. That's how it described the Canadian team. The Dominions defeated the Negro Haters as part of the tournament. That was their description of baseball at that time. And so the two prominent teams that developed were not only the Maple Leaf of Guelph, but the Tecumsehs of London, who probably by about the 1876-77 season were amongst the top 10 or 15 teams in all of North America. They were aggressive recruiters of baseball players, not only in Ontario, but they had now gone essentially fully professional. And so we're bringing in some of the better players from the United States. The London Tecumsehs premier player would have been Fred Goldsmith, who went on to be a notable career as a curveball pitcher with Chicago in the National League in the 1880s. And this is a picture of that rough and ready London Tecumseh team that won the International Association pennant of 1877. I could get into an extremely long, perhaps boring argument about why I believe the International Association should have major league status alongside a lot of other leagues that only lasted 1 year. At least the International was international for 2 years and did last 4 years, and did make an aggressive attempt to broaden its membership to incorporate not only teams from across the border, in this case, in the first season, 2 Canadian teams, but even a team from San Francisco, recognizing that in 1877, that would have been a pretty long road trip, and obviously they would simply have been members of the association, not active players within the association. And we even have records of a women's team being formed in Ontario in 1872. This one was in Guelph, Ontario. We heard mooted that a number of young ladies in town intend organizing a baseball club under the cognomen of the Female Athletics. Yeah, they were the original Oakland Athletics. No, I'm joking. We presume the active secretary of the Maple Leaf Club would only be too happy to take charge of its management. And so the 20th century of baseball in Ontario was largely distinguished by minor league baseball. And there was nothing particularly wrong with that. In fact, it was quite joyous for myself growing up in Toronto in those days. In the upper right-hand corner, that is what we're referred to, that is referred to as Hanlon's Point. And I would point out that it's spelled Hanlan, not Lon, as the Baltimore manager his name was so spelled. Hanlon's Point was named after Ned Hanlan, who was the world champion oarsman of the 1870s. And the ballpark was built over the island, on the island. And so to get there, you had to have a pass. You had to actually take the ferry. And what I'm showing at the top there is a token, which actually I have in my possession, of the ferry service to that ballpark in 1923. And that would have entitled you not only to get to the ballpark on the local boat ferry, but also to get into the game for an entire season. It was your season ticket. And of course, many will know that the only minor league home run hit by this guy on the 5th of September, 1914, was hit in this very ballpark. And the report of the game says he hit the ball into the bleachers. And ever since then, people have said, oh, it must be somewhere floating in Lake Ontario. Well, I tend to believe are a part that was written at the time rather than people trying to reflect on it years later. And even this great moment in baseball history, I can make an argument that it was made that Bill Mazeroski's home run in 1960 was made possible by this guy, Rocky Nelson, with the score 9-8 Pittsburgh in the top of the ninth in 1960. A sharply hit ground ball to Mr. Nelson at first base gave him a choice. Mickey Mantle was on first base. So there was one out. And one could make a pretty good argument that the obvious play would be, if one was thinking, and one can understand why one might not have been thinking, would it be throw to second base to retire Mantle and then catch the ball back at first base and retire. I believe it was Yogi Berra, who was not fleet of foot, who was coming down the baselines. However, Mantle actually, perhaps what many people would have done naturally, was actually stepped on first base, therefore removing the forced play at second. And Mickey Mantle, if for those who have memory of this, slid back into first base and was safe. The run scored from third. The game went to the bottom of the ninth inning, and as a result, Bill Mazeroski was able to hit his famous home run to win the World Series of that year. And minor league ball, as I say, inspired young people like myself with a love of baseball. This is actually a photo of myself in 1958 in my faux Toronto Maple Leafs baseball uniform. One of our local grocery stores sold these uniforms. What I've subsequently found out was $4.50, and we could dress like real live baseball players and pretend to be ball players like our heroes at this ballpark in the center, which is Maple Leaf Stadium, which was built in 1926 for the Toronto Maple Leafs and lasted through the team's life to the end of the 1967 season when the team left town and went to Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm going to kind of conclude with an observation about some things that we in Canada should be celebrating come the year 2027. It's only a couple of years away, and there's multiple reasons for this to be a major year in the baseball calendar of Canada. One of those is it'll be 50 years since the Toronto Blue Jays' first season. It will be 100 years since those AA Toronto Maple Leafs, that was AA at that time, of the International League, defeated Babe Ruth's touring historic 1927 team, ostensibly said by some to be the greatest of all time. It'll be 150 years since Labatt's Memorial Park, originally known as Tecumseh Park, was built for use by the London Tecumseh, or Tecumseh, as my friend Chip Martin would say. It is baseball's oldest continuing ballpark, at least according to the Guinness Book of Records, and we're prepared to go to bat for that argument. And it'll be 150 years since London won the international title. So, in conclusion, my proposal is, why not a Major League Baseball game in London's historic ballpark, this 150-year site of baseball? Logically, the two teams to play would be the Detroit Tigers and the Toronto Blue Jays. It's 2 years away. There's still time for it to happen. And given that baseball played a game this year at Rickman Field in Alabama and has played games in the past at Field of Dreams, a game in a small but historic ballpark would seem to be an appropriate type of thing to do. So, as I say in conclusion, Old Ontario at Bat is over 350 pages, so a heck of a lot more than I was able to include in tonight's topic, but I guess this gives you a sense of it. I thank the Center for Canadian Baseball Research for being the publisher, and the brilliant artist Sean Kane for the work he did on the book, and particularly the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, whose annual induction ceremony this year will be on the 6th and 7th of June, and will feature Jose Bautista amongst other significant attendees. And I want to thank all of you for listening to a guy who joined SABR in 1978. And as Bruce said, has the distinction of being, and I'll always have this distinction of being, the first Canadian to be a member of the Society for American Baseball Research's board of directors. That was way back in 82, 83. Thank you very much.
Jose Bautista the guy who, as far as I am concerned, had the greatest bat flip in the history of bat flips.
And now it's taken for granted,
And
right?
now it's taken for granted. Yes.
Everyone does it, and nobody makes a big deal of it. When it happened, it was considered, oh, that's just not baseball to do that. But
Frank, the year after, when Roughneck Odor slid into second,
yes,
or when he slid into second on Roughneck Odor, and Odor popped him. I mean,
Yep.
not only was it the greatest bat flip of all time, but that guy took it on the chin and walked off the field.
yeah. There was only one disappointment with that.
What's that?
That Batista, like a good hockey player, didn't pull Odor's sweater over the top of his head like good hockey players used to do in the old days and pound the crap out of him, but it didn't happen. So
See, now you're singing my song as a former employee of the old Hartford Whalers.
yes.
So there you go.
Yeah.
If you have a question for our presenter, William Humber, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. You will see another button marked raise hand. Punch that button, raise your hand, and get in line to ask questions of our presenter, William Humber, this evening. We've already got some in line. First up, look out. It's my wife, Molly. Go.
First of all, thank you, William, for coming tonight. This isn't directly related to the book and your beautiful presentation, but I noticed you showed some newspaper articles and some artifacts from Quebec. I was
Yes.
wondering, when did they go from being English written to French primarily?
Well, I mean, it was originally New France, so there was always French, right? The following, of course, the American Revolution, when people streamed north of the border who were loyalists, many of them went into Quebec, and particularly into western Quebec, largely near the American border. And that's where, in fact, that incident had occurred in Lower Canada in 1838. So there was always a large Anglo component in Montreal and Quebec. It is a long and winding story to give you a full kind of breakdown of the geopolitics of language in Canada, and particularly within Quebec, where the feeling has always been that French will disappear as a language, but which somehow has become incredibly resilient. And now throughout Canada, many, many, many families now send their children to French immersion programs to become well versed in the two official languages of Canada. I could give a longer winded answer, but it would, we're getting into areas of politics. It's probably best I just leave it at that for now.
No, it was perfect. Thank you very much.
William Highland, you are up, my friend. Will, how you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well, Bruce. And thank you to my fellow William. That was a great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. Many people on the call may recall that my family hails from the province of Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a distinct appreciation for all things north of our border. My question, though, is so similar in our country, baseball made a migration west, mid 20th century in popularity, obviously with the teams
Yeah.
and whatnot. Did baseball in Canada follow a similar trajectory west in terms of its popularity?
It's always been, I think, a reality of baseball in Canada that it's had largely a north-south flow. So even baseball in Ontario, they would refer to the championships played in the 19th century as the championships of Canada, when in fact it was really just the championship of Ontario. There was no Atlantic Canada membership. There was no Quebec participation. All of their baseball affection went north-south. So you'll find an extraordinary number of Maritimers, Atlantic Canadians, who are Boston Red Sox fans. They just, that's the normal gravitation of that. There was some movement of baseball from Ontario into Manitoba, but even in Western Canada, British Columbia, most of the interaction of baseball was once again north-south between the Pacific coast of the United States and Victoria and Vancouver, British Columbia. And so the first actual national team formed in Canada, national baseball team, despite the age of the sport in Canada, wasn't until around 1967, the Pan American Games. It was the first kind of bringing together of a team from the entire country. That kind of nationalist sensibility of forming teams is now well embedded in Baseball Canada, but it took a long time to happen because of that north-south direction.
Thank you.
Next up from the Elysian Fields chapter is Craig Garrettson. Craig, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
Go get him.
I'm wondering, do you think Major League Baseball will return to Canada? I'm just kidding about the Blue Jays, but do you think what went wrong with the Expos, and do you think Montreal will get a new team with this talk of expansion?
10 years ago, I would have said yes. Today, I find it hard to believe. Well, first of all, the government of Quebec decided to upgrade Olympic Stadium, which was a disaster for baseball in Montreal, and put $1 billion into its upgrading. For the life of me, I can't figure out if they put that $1 billion into building a real ballpark. I would say, yeah, the chances are better. I would never say they're great. The other factor is simply, what is the value of a franchise now? I mean, if you can play players upwards of, towards $1 billion, how much is a franchise now worth? And I don't know if there's an entrepreneurial class in Quebec that's prepared to invest that. When the team left, they could have been bought locally for about $100 million. And even that was considered by people at the time risky. But remember, this is a province that allowed the Quebec Nordique, one of the great hockey teams of the National Hockey League, to leave. So I'd love to see another baseball team in Montreal, and it was such a great heritage, that whole kind of history. But I call me dubious, I guess, is all I can say at this point.
Is there a Canadian city that would be a better candidate?
The only other city that would be possible would be Vancouver. Vancouver has a population side and there was talk at one time that baseball would expand to Vancouver. It just seems to me now that the financial thing has got so out of control. I mean, the Canadian dollar now is less than 70 cents against the US dollar. So a $2 billion US fee for expansion, or whatever it might be, is 3 billion Canadian. That gets to be a pretty huge sock of money. And I'd love to see it. I mean, let's face it, the Toronto Blue Jays paid $7 million to join the league when they joined in 1977. Who knows how much that, franchise is worth now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Next up is Ben Abel. Ben, how you doing?
Doing great. So
Go get him.
who else is Canadian in this here in this talk? Because it's really interesting to me to have Williams talk, just because of the history of Canadian baseball, obviously, and Canada. And so I thank you for that. And I thank you for the history lesson too, because I took Canadian pre and post Confederation history in university. So I'm well versed in what happened after the American Revolution, when a lot of people fled the US to come to Canada because they were loyal to the British Empire. And a lot of them actually settled in the Acadian provinces as well, William, including Ontario, including Quebec, including Nova Scotia, including New Brunswick. I wouldn't say Newfoundland because that was French. But yeah, no,
well, it was farther afield too.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting history. And then Bruce says he thinks there's going to be people fleeing again. Yeah, I guess it could be.
Well, Canada's now approaching 42 million people, so we're not as small as we used to be. I often think when we start talking about economies of scale, we're actually starting to talk, about something that kind of makes a lot more sense now than it might have made it at one point. There's of course a famous story that probably doesn't get repeated that often in the United States, that after the American Revolution was over, the British were leaving New York City, which they held in their possession, and they had over 3,000 people, black people who had been former slaves. And George Washington said, well, we want them back, and we're sending them back to their owners. And Guy Carleton effectively said, I'm sure he said it in more, roundish English. He said effectively, nope, they're free men. They've identified with us, and they're coming with us. and they did come with the British largely to Atlantic Canada. Now, the circumstances they found in Atlantic Canada were not as ideal as they might have hoped for, but at least there was a moment of some generosity that had been shown at one point during that particularly ugly period of time in history.
David Siegel, you're up. How you doing, David?
Good, good. Okay. I'm a Canadian, well, yeah, Canadian and American, but I'm in Arizona right now, actually. And I just this Bill's book is a great book. I almost finished it this afternoon, but I had to stop in order to get on this call. My question is, as somebody who's interested in the Toronto Maple Leafs,
Yep.
you talked about the Guelph Maple Leafs, and that's a long storied franchise in the 19th century. A lot of other teams have used maple leaf.
Yep.
You know where that originated? I mean, we know the maple leaf is associated with at least Eastern Canada.
Sure.
Do you have an idea of what team might have used that appellation for the first time?
Well, intriguingly enough, the first team to use it in Toronto sometime in the early 1860s was a cricket club, which so they were in fact ahead of the naming of a baseball club. The Hamilton Young Canadians, as they were called, were formed in 1854. By the early 1860s, they had changed their name to the Maple Leaf. And I think it was because Woodstock had also adopted the Young Canadians name. And so they decided, well, we'll go with something that says something about us locally, but has some difference associated with. So all of these uses of the term Maple Leaf, whether it was by, baseball teams, cricket clubs, or whatever, long predated the Toronto Maple Leaf Hockey Club. And, locally in Toronto tonight, if you were able to watch the hockey game, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I don't have it on here, but I'm positive Eric Zweig might be able to confirm this for me, are wearing the old Toronto St. Patrick's sweater, which was, of course, the original name of the Leafs. Well, it was certainly the name before the Leafs. There were other Toronto professional teams before the St. Pats, but appropriately enough, they were the name of the team before Conn Smythe changed the name to the Maple Leafs.
See, I haven't been watching, but I will check.
Thanks.
I hadn't even thought of that, but I'm sure you're right. They're so ugly, those. Oh, yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Big, ugly green. Can people see if I hold it up?
There we are.
Oh God.
Yeah, it just
Well,
switched there away. Oh, there they are. There's the
Yep.
yeah.
well,
The Reds have a tradition of wearing a mostly green uniform for spring training today. Many of the ball clubs
Yeah, they do.
down there still do it as well. The Reds started the tradition back in, I think it was 77 or 78. There's been pictures posted online today of Johnny Bench in one of those green uniforms, and he doesn't look happy about it. This doesn't look happy about it. Dixie Tarango, you're up, man. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Bill, great presentation. Thank you very much for that. I was wondering, in your vast amount of research, if you are familiar with the name Edward Somerville.
Tell me a little more. It might mean something to me.
I think he played for Guelph or someplace there, 1870s, and he was a star player, maybe the captain of the team, maybe the third baseman, but he died during the season.
Yeah, he was with London. He was with
okay.
the London Tecumseh ball team, and died shortly before they played Pittsburgh for the International Association Championship.
He was from Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Yeah. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was consumption that took him, or tuberculosis, or pneumonia.
I think maybe, but it was very quick when it happened.
Yeah.
He was playing and playing and playing, and suddenly he was dead.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the amazing, when you do research in the 19th century, you're struck. It's horrific. You're struck by the fact that children, they did not reach the age of 5 in half the cases of children born. Women died in childbirth. even men, healthy men, would get the sniffles in their 30s, and a year or two later, they were dead of consumption. It just happens so often that you wonder, how were these people ever to rise above the kind of almost the horror of daily life to, to create something as wonderful as baseball?
Horror of daily life? Jeez. Some things never change. I mean, really. Well, tell them how do they get the book?
Oh, Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, Ontario. Very Googleable. Is that a word? Google it. Scott Crawford is the curator, the manager there, the director. He will take care of all your needs. As I say, the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, St. Mary's, Ontario. If you Google it, it's the first thing that comes up, and it'll take you to their shop, and you can buy the book. And of course, you can buy it at Canadian rates, so it's a bargain if you're dealing in American dollars. I assume that unless Scott has put an American dollar price on it too, and if he has, good for him.
Let's go to Dixie for the answer to the trivia question. Dixie.
Okay, well, Andrew North answered the question correctly a long time ago, just after we asked it, really. But I must say that the guess of Dusty Rhodes was about the best guess you could make and still be wrong. Again, the question was who attained the batting line for one World Series, the only World Series he ever played in. He batted 4 times in 4 different games as a pinch hitter. He walked, he struck out, and he hit 2 home runs. That was in 1959, and the batter was Chuck Asegian.
Household name.
It was then.
He was then. There you go. That's right. All right. I'm not doing this next Monday. I'm not. I'm going to be traveling. I'm not stopping side the road to hold a meeting. I'm sorry. I'm going to travel back from New Jersey. So I'm moving Monday's meeting to Wednesday night, March 26th, where we're going to have a good one coming up. Gabriel Lerman is going to be here, and he is going to be discussing Japanese baseball and what makes it such a compelling experience. The registration link is in the SABR events calendar at sabr.org/events or in our meeting booklet published each Monday in the Monday Message newsletter. If you're subscribed to our automatic sign-up service, you'll get your join the meeting link Tuesday the 25th. Don't delete the email. It's your ticket for entry. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org today. William Humber, you're fantastic. That was amazing. Thank you very much.
Can I just, another book that I've just completed at the same time is about Tex Simone. And anybody who's familiar with the International League will know that Tex was the man behind baseball in Syracuse for almost 50 years. And I completed that with the Simone family, and the book has just come out and it is available on Amazon. So Tex Simone, for those who are minor league baseball fans and fans of the Blue Jays, because of course Syracuse was the primary farm club of the Blue Jays for over 30 seasons.
We might have to have you back to discuss that book too.
Well, here I am.
All right. Let's get everybody out of here. We'll see you next Wednesday night, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks for coming.